Well, good morning. Good morning. Our speaker today is Kathy Reilly. She's a Vermont native. She co-owns the Vermont Violins with her husband Orrin, where she manages the manufacture of the Violin line of violins and violas, the American distribution of hardwood, which is a sustainable wood alternative to ebony, and the company's other activities in instrument sales and restoration. The principles of environmental sustainability and community development have served as key guidelines for her business growth. Vermont Violins incorporates long-term policies that conserve rare resources, such as
Pernambuco,
ivory and ebony. Sustainable wood use is key to manufacturing and of the company at large. And Kathleen has recently been elected to the board of the Violin Society of America, in no small part also noticed the latest award for exports. Would you please welcome Kathy Reilly, St. Albans.
All right, I'm gonna try and talk loud. If that's not working, just raise your hand and I'll move over to the mic, okay? All right. So yeah, we just got the award from the state of Vermont, the Small Business Administration for the state of Vermont for our exports. And largely those exports are the ebony alternatives that I'll talk a little bit about in the PowerPoint presentation coming up. So just a little bit about our company. We've been around for about 30 years in Vermont. It's a family-owned business, so my husband and I, and now our son, run the company. We started out just doing mostly rentals and repairs and restoration. We've expanded that to making instruments based on needs that we saw in the musical community. We deal specifically with the violin family instruments. However, many of the issues that I'm going to talk about today are similar for guitars, mandolins, pianos, oboes, clarinets. All of these instruments, we're running into the same issues, which is that the woods we use to make these instruments are becoming endangered, threatened, and now with climate change, we're looking at our tonewoods, which we've always considered to be, relatively common, like maple and spruce, running into problems. So we're going to start by going back to climate change, just so that I can kind of set the lay of the land as we see it from the musical community. This says the Alliance, because that's kind of the hat I'm wearing today. The Alliance is a nonprofit that was set up by the international violin making community because individual makers didn't have enough time to become kind of educated on what's going on with environmental issues. And I happen to have this unique niche where I graduated with a master's degree from the University of Vermont as a field naturalist. Hub Vogelman, I don't know if any of you know him. He was really influential in the acid rain issues in the 1970s, was the director of that program. I worked for the Nature Conservancy as a scientist doing preserve management, and then went back to my career in the music industry. So that's kind of why I'm here. The Alliance was developed to look at those environmental issues and educate makers around the world. So my specific job there is directing the curriculum committee, which works with the Lutherie schools internationally. So Italy, Cremona, Parma, Mittenwald in Germany, Méricourt in France, Quebec National School, and we're hoping to reach out to the Beijing School in China. We're doing it indirectly right now. Okay. So let's see. So climate change. There's this organization called the Intergovernmental Planet on Climate Change. That's kind of a mouthful. But they track internationally how temperatures, average temperatures are changing around the world. One thing to note is that the temperature changes are not evenly distributed, and the northern latitudes are being hit harder than some of the southern latitudes right now. That's unfortunate for the musical community because a lot of the tonewoods that we use grow in those northern latitudes, like here, and Northern Europe, and the Alps. That's where we get the majority of our tonewoods from, that spruce maple species as well. The musical community has not really keyed into that. Right now we're using tonewoods, tropical woods faster than they're reproducing. And that's been the historical way we've done it. People will go out, luthiers and makers go out, and when they see wood that they like, they buy a lifetime supply. And they put it aside in their workshops. And they think, well, if I don't use it, I'm going to pass it on down to the next generation. There's never been any awareness of the impact we might be having on that tonewood supply, on the tropical woods that we've used. It just never occurred to us. So this has been a rude awakening in the past 5 to 10 years. So when I talk to luthiers and makers, most of them have no idea what climate change really means. We talk about 10 degrees change, 3 degrees change, like what does that mean? So I usually start with our home, and I talk about the whale's tails that we have on the side of I-89 now in South Burlington, Vermont, actually right near my shop, which is great. We go and walk over there and check them out. For us, what the whale's tails represent is our connection to ecosystems that we don't see, both in the past, in the present, and in the future. So 10,000 years ago, Vermont's average temperature was about 11 degrees colder than it was in 1900. That's not that much, but it was in the midst of an ice age. And the ice was so thick on our landscape here that the surface of our, what we walk on every day was actually depressed. And it was so low that the Atlantic Ocean actually flowed down through the St. Lawrence into what's now Lake Champlain, and it was called the Champlain Sea. And in that Champlain Sea, we had beluga whales. And those skeletons were in the geology department of the University of Vermont for a while. I'm sure they're there somewhere at this point. As the climate warmed back up, the Earth went back up. The water, instead of draining from the Atlantic Ocean into Lake Champlain, reversed. Lake Champlain became a freshwater lake. The beluga whales migrated back up to the Saguenay Fjord just north of Quebec, so about 400 miles north. And our environment started changing to what we're familiar with today. So we have the typical maple, birch, beech, hardwood forests that we're all familiar with. So that's what I live in Duxbury, Vermont. So I'm up around 1,100 feet, and this is a maple sugar shack that my neighbor has. It's not the prettiest maple sugar shack, but he does a good job. Since 1900, our average temperature has already risen 3 degrees Fahrenheit. The projected, in 50 to 60 years, the projected temperature change is about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And what they're saying is that our forests right now will change to look more like what's in West Virginia. So the maple sugars will be gone, the red maples will be gone. We're going to be looking at oak, beech, aspen kind of forest situation. So that's by the turn of the century. So that's my son's lifetime. So again, that Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change set a temperature rise of 3 degrees Fahrenheit for 2030. Unfortunately, we surpassed that 3 degrees average temperature rise last October. So in October of 2024. So that's why you see all of these commentaries on our projections for climate change. How is it going to impact things? Are our projections correct? What do we do? So right now we're kind of in no man's land in terms of knowing exactly what's going to happen and how things are going to change. What they do know is that there are going to be a lot of endangered species that are going to go extinct because they won't be able to change fast enough to adapt to that climate change. So there's another organization, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is really just a group of scientists worldwide who track endangered species. And they're saying roughly 11,000 species are going to disappear by the end of this century. And on that list are some of the species that we've used traditionally for instrument making. So I'm going to start with Pernambuco. How many of you have ever heard of Pernambuco? Right? No. How many of you have seen a bow that a violinist or a cellist uses when they're playing their instruments? Right? So if you go to a concert, an orchestra concert, whether it's the kids at the local school or the VSO, all of those players have these bows that are made out of a wood called Pernambuco. Pernambuco is an interesting wood. It grows in one place in the world only, and that's along the Atlantic coastal forests of Brazil. Now, we all talk about the Amazon forests in Brazil. That's a whole other forest range. This area is considered a bio-hotspot by scientists around the world. It is a kind of an island. It is separated from the rest of Brazil by natural barriers and from the rest of the world by the ocean. So these species are considered endemic. They're not found anywhere else in the world. And Pernambuco is a tree species that is found in those forests. These forests have fauna including jaguar, monkeys, birds, insects, ferns, and trees. They are interdependent, which means that on their own, they don't survive. These animals and birds are reliant on the tropical forests that they are in. And those trees are reliant on these animals for reproducing, right? The seeds, distribution of the seeds, fertilization, all kinds of things. So when one of these species disappears, it starts setting off a domino effect within those tropical forests. Most of the major international conservation funds, whether you're talking World Wildlife, Nature Conservancy, the list goes on, Audubon, they're all investing millions of dollars into protecting these forest systems. Unfortunately, less than 10% of those forests remain at this point. The original coastal forests were about the size of New York, so it wasn't huge to begin with. Now it's down to about half the size of Rhode Island. And the problem is that it's not one contiguous forest. Like the Green Mountains, we have a contiguous forest where species can interact, where plants can change, move. That's not the case here. We have a lot of postage stamp size plots of land. Some are owned by the government, some are owned by individuals privately. And that's what's remaining at this point. So there's a lot of concern about this. Pernambuco is one of those species. It was listed by Brazil as an endangered species in 1994. So it has been an endangered species for quite a long time at this point. The main threat to Pernambuco, aside from road building and agriculture, which was a concern for that area as a whole, has been those Pernambuco bows for musicians. They compared Pernambuco to drug trafficking. The people who were illegally harvesting the Pernambuco were making so much money that they just couldn't stop. And the market for most of those bows was the United States. So Fish and Wildlife was actually, US Fish and Wildlife was actually part of a sting operation to help try and control the harvesting, the illegal harvesting of wood in Brazil. Our bows often contain other species listed by CITES, and I'll talk more about CITES in a minute, on Appendix 1 or 2, in addition to Pernambuco. The species range from ebony, used in the frogs, abalone for pearl eyes and slides. These are all decorations. Snake and lizard skins for bow grips, ivory and tortoiseshell as well. None of these materials make the bows inherently more valuable. Increasing restrictions do make it more difficult to travel with the bows across country borders. So a lot of countries, not just the United States, have laws that make it illegal to traffic endangered species across borders. And species like Pernambuco that have gone to an international trade protection level, you have to have special paperwork to travel with that wood. Like Pernambuco, tree species containing ebony could be some of the 11,000 species at risk. Luthiers have used ebony for fingerboards, whether it's guitars or violins. Pianos have also used ebony for hundreds of years. Originally, violins did not use ebony. They used a more common maple or less expensive woods. But when ebony started becoming more popular in Europe for furniture making, especially for kings and queens, it traveled down to the luthier level, and they're like, oh, this is a really hard, really stiff wood that helps keep our necks from warping. Guitars were doing the same thing. Ebony is a lot of different species that grow anywhere from Madagascar, Mozambique, Central and Eastern or Western Africa, up the eastern coast, over through India, down through Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and all the way down to Australia. Lots of different species, lots of different genus. Most luthiers didn't realize that. They just bought ebony. One by one, those ebony species have been going onto a threatened list or an endangered species list because we've used so much of it. The music industry is currently the single largest market for ebony. Roughly 1 in 10 trees cut contains the dense dark heartwood that we refer to as ebony. So what they'll do is they'll go out and they'll cut 10 trees down to find one tree that has the dark heartwood that we use for ebony. The remaining logs are typically left to rot to make room on the logging trucks for the much more valuable wood. The music industry's increasing rate of consumption has far outpaced the regeneration rate of ebony trees, which can take 80 to 100 years to mature. The waste and search of ebony has created a domino effect. One by one, region by region, tree species have been listed as vulnerable, then threatened, and finally endangered, as high demand and prices for ebony fuels illegal logging. In Madagascar alone, that was that island off of Eastern Africa, 114 species are listed as endangered. From Africa to Australia, logging of different ebony species is currently regulated or banned altogether. Now, some of these bans and regulations are country-specific, others are going to the international level. Unsustainable logging and the importance of forest ecosystems, that goes back to climate change. Given climate change have led to layers of laws and regulations that apply to the music industry, including our instruments. So we're going to start with CITES. This is the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. This is an organization, it's not government run, but 184 countries have signed on to this treaty that says that they're going to abide by regulations set in a convention that happens every 3 years to regulate the trade across country borders of endangered species. So when a country like Brazil says, okay, we have put in place an endangered species law in Brazil that is being ignored by the international community, they bring it up to CITES. And then all of the nations get together and they decide what they're going to do. And that is then controlled by Customs and Borders Protection. So if you go through the border now with an ivory frog on your bow and you hit the Canadian border and they look at your bow and see that ivory frog, they're going to confiscate it because that ivory is protected by CITES. Threatened species are listed by CITES in appendices. The top two, Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, are critical to preventing a species going extinct. Appendix 2 is for endangered species that are not currently threatened with extinction but may become so without commercial trade restrictions. That's where Pernambuco was put. Appendix 1 includes species threatened with extinction. It provides the greatest level of protection and prohibits commercial trade of products containing these species. So for Pernambuco and the ebony species we were talking about before, they're on Appendix 2, which means that you cannot cut those trees and export those raw logs without a specific permit from CITES, that when you get to Customs and Border Protection, they will request a copy of that to prove that you have the legal authority to cut that wood, all right? If it goes to Appendix 1, then not only can you not transfer those raw logs, but you can't transfer any products made with that species without CITES permission. And that, again, will be examined at the border as you go through by Customs and Border Protection. So Pernambuco was listed on CITES Appendix 2 in 2008. From 2008 to 2022, the international market for raw Pernambuco was very lucrative. Like we said, it was compared with the drug trade and continued outside Brazil's control. So ideally, if you list something on Appendix 2, you should see both harvesting going down and the production of products made with that material decreasing. Brazil saw just the opposite happening. More bows were being made in Brazil. So when they put it on Appendix 2, they asked all the bow makers in Brazil, they said, look, you have to register all your wood. So they registered all their wood. So the government knew how many bows could be produced. And yet, the Brazil makers were making more bows than they had before, and their stockpiles weren't going down. Within Brazil, the number of bow makers and amount of wood being used and number of bows being built increased despite heavy restrictions on logging. So in June 2022, Brazil strengthened its national laws to require export documentation to verify the legal status of wood being used to make finished bows by Brazilian bow makers. In November 2022, they were having one of those 3-year conventions for CITES. Brazil proposed at the CITES convention that Pernambuco be upgraded from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1 due to continued illegal logging of a species at risk of disappearing from its natural habitat. A final decision was postponed in 2022, pending progress by the music community on recommendations. These were the recommendations until December of 2025. So this comes up again this year in CITES. And the bow-making community, the musicians community, the National League of American Orchestras has been working really hard to try and meet CITES objectives, and we'll talk more about that. So this was the sting, a result of that sting operation I was talking about between U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Brazilian equivalent. If Pernambuco is upgraded to Appendix 1, bows may require a special passport to move across country borders. So like we personally have to have a passport to go over to Europe, The bows as well would need to have their own passport that showed that they had CITES regulated wood that was legally harvested. All right? So musicians will likely need to document the following for their bows: who made the bow, when the bow was made, what materials are in the bow, called a declaration of materials, a sales receipt, details on the legal status of the Pernambuco, and possibly a certificate of authenticity for bows that predate 2008. So CITES is just one level of regulatory action that we're facing right now. CITES works to regulate the trade of endangered species. Individual countries and the European Union have taken steps to regulate the market for the species throughout the supply chain. So, like this guy says, so this is a smuggler, this is a guy who's illegally harvesting wood in Singapore and dealing with it. If somebody asks me to smuggle, they're going to cut it. If they don't have buyers, they're not going to smuggle. So that is what the psychology that the European Union, the United States, South Korea, even China, Australia, New Zealand, a long list of countries are starting to operate under. And what they're looking at is the supply chain within their countries. So the Lacey Act, how many of you guys have heard of the Lacey Act? Right? No. It's been around since 1900. And it was first created actually to control the killing of birds for women's hats in the late 1800s. It was a huge market and bird species were going extinct. So Lacey was a senator at the time, was driving him nuts. He was like, look, I'm gonna stop this. And so it was originally created to regulate the market for endangered species within the United States. So the Lacey Act is the tool USDA and Fish and Wildlife use to track and prosecute the commercial trade of endangered species coming into the US. It also works within the US, as I just explained. The Lacey Act focuses on trade, controlling the sale and purchase of goods made with illegally sourced plant and animal products. The feeling is that if there is no market, then the incentive for illegal logging drops. The Lacey Act covers illegal logging within the US as well as illegal timber imports from foreign countries. A large US tonewood supplier, J&R, was heavily fined under the Lacey Act and went bankrupt for illegally extracting tonewood logs from federal forests in the Pacific Northwest. I think it was big leaf maple specifically. In 2009, Gibson Guitars was fined over $300,000 under the Lacey Act for importing illegally harvested ebony from Madagascar. Lacey Act documentation is required for imports valued at $2,500 or more of wood or wood products, including musical instruments. So when I import violins from Europe, I have to fill out a declaration form that lists the wood species, where it was harvested, for every single wooden part of that instrument. So spruce, fingerboards, spruce tops, maple, backs and ribs, ebony fingerboards, which we're not importing anymore, ebony. But all of your furniture, the same thing is going on. So, and if it's laminated, they're listing all of the different species in those laminates. If it is plywood, they're listing all of the possible species and the country of origin for each of those species in the plywood. All of that is going on without your even knowing it. And there's a whole system for identifying wood that these big timber companies are using. They're actually like genetically marking the wood in large piles so that they can trace where it's going. So importers and purchasers are responsible for asking the questions and verifying the information provided, and it can even include site visits. So if we are importing ebony, and we know that it's a risky species to be importing because of the illegal logging trade, we may be asked, have you actually gone physically to the site where your supplier says it was grown from to double check that that actually occurred? And that's what happened to Gibson guitars, was that the location that the supplier said that would have been harvested from did not physically have trees of a dimension, ebony trees of a dimension that met the specs that were listed on that paperwork. And that's how they were prosecuted. The Lacey Act is a strict liability law. Any lawyers in the field here? Okay. Importers and purchasers under strict liability are responsible for knowing the legal status of the musical instruments and bows they purchase. Legal precedents place the burden of proof, due diligence, on the importers and purchasers. So if we are prosecuted, the government doesn't have to prove that it was illegally harvested. We have to prove that it was legally harvested. And ignorance is not a get out of jail free card. We can't say we didn't know. Strong penalties and fines include forfeiture of goods and a minimum of $250. That's just the start. The European Union is instituting the most far-reaching regulation to impact the music industry's use of wood to date. The EU deforestation regulation is Europe's serious effort to reverse the course of climate change by reducing market impact on forest ecosystems. The regulation requires sustainable wood sourcing for all wood products sold in the European Union market. So we require documentation under the Lacey Act that the wood was legally harvested. The European Union is saying, okay, it has to be legally harvested, but you also have to document that it was sustainably harvested. And that doesn't mean just the wood itself. It means if you're getting it from an Indian tribe reservation, you have to document that it is not having a negative economic impact on that tribe. Indigenous peoples in Latin America, in Africa, you have to show that you did not have a negative economic impact on those peoples. You can't use child labor. You know, that applies to the cocoa industry in particular. So there are all of these layers that European Union deforestation regulation is putting in place. And that means for us, if we wanted to export our instruments to Europe, we would have to document for the person importing that we haven't crossed the boundary on any of those aspects that law covers. And for manufacturers in Europe who are importing wood, they also have to document all the way back to the place of harvest. And they're even requiring GPS locations for where those trees are harvested from in that new regulation. So climate change is having a huge impact on all of us in the wood industry. So climate change regulations, laws encourage us to move in the direction of sustainability. And so I'm going to talk more about what we're doing. Does anybody have questions about that part of the presentation? That's a lot of information, so sorry to hit you with that on a cold, gray, dreary day. All right. I mean, it sounds really serious, but in actuality, it's in our best interests. All of these regulations are not just like random regulations that are saying, okay, we're going to nail you with fees and fines and get your shit together. It's really about creating a source of wood for an industry like ours, which is totally dependent on these woods being there. You know, they've been there for hundreds of years, but it is not necessarily true that they're going to continue to be there unless we change our habits. And so what these are really reflecting is our own need to change. And there's a lot we can do. So the League of American Orchestras took CITES requirements for Pernambuco really seriously, and they've started a campaign called the Know Your Bow campaign, and they have over the past 2 years, and I'm part of that. I go and talk to these Suzuki festivals, to kids and teachers across the country, and say, look, this is the situation. This is what you're buying. By all means, don't drop it and break it, because it's an endangered species. You know, you have to be really careful with this wood. You're privileged to be able to use it. And you need to know where it came from and that it was legally sourced. Because if it isn't, you are not going to be able to travel with your youth orchestra across over to Europe and get through Customs and Border Protection without documentation. So know what you're buying, ask the questions. All of the bow makers got together across the world per CITES requirement. There was no declaration of materials. This was a 2-year battle to come up with this form and like what would be on this form. But it is now internationally accepted by bow makers, and shops are starting to use it as well. So that we are for the first time declaring what the woods are in these bows, what the species are used in these bows, and where they came from, which country they were harvested in. Sustainably sourcing wood. So I'm part of a group that is actively looking for FSC certified or SFI certified wood. Those are some of the organizations that have an auditing process in place on the ground. I don't know, have any of you guys ever heard of FSC? Which is interesting. It's one of the largest sustainable certification organizations in the world right now, and it actually started in Vermont. So that came from here. Anyway, Robin Haskins is the Director of Natural Resources for the Coquille tribe out in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. We've been working with them actively they are FSC certified. Actually, the tribal reservations, the tribal nations in the Pacific Northwest have been kind of on the cutting edge of getting wood that they sell actively off their lands as an income generating stream, FSC certified. And so that's one of the sources that we're using to get wood for our instruments. So the violas that we use, that we build, often use big leaf maple and myrtle that come off of the Coquille Reservation in southern Oregon. So these are 3 of the largest sustainably certifying organizations. PEFC, Program for the Enforcement, is largely in Europe. FSC, their headquarters are now in Germany. SFI is largely the United States, but they also work hand in hand with the PEFC in Europe as well. So the European Union deforestation regulation requires that the whole supply chain be sustainably certified. So that's why you see this chain of custody being listed here. That means the land where it's harvested from, the loggers who harvest it, the sawmills who cut it, the transportation companies, the importers who purchase it, the manufacturing companies who manufacture it, and the shops who sell it, all have to be sustainably certified, which is quite a chore. We're just getting our FSC certification. We'll be the first, I think we're going to be the first violin making shop and manufacturer worldwide to get that, in part because FSC is here. So it's easy for us. And they happen to be really great crew. But it costs $2,800 a year to have that certification. And you get audited every year as part of that. Where possible, moving away from endangered species altogether. So like I said, we just got that Exporter of the Year award from the state of Vermont. And that's because we've been working really hard to develop alternatives to ebony. And we export these around the world right now. We've got These going mostly to the Lutheran schools in Europe, but we also have them going to individual makers in Europe. The one we're most proud of is Gaiatone. That's actually a post-consumer recycled paper from the Pacific Northwest that is an FSC certified product made with a green resin, so a non-petroleum resin, and it's a very low emitting formaldehyde that they use to initiate the binding process. That's the only FSC certified product that's going to be out there on the market. Another one, and I'm sorry this isn't a good picture of it, is Sonawood. We also make product in the United States for makers in North America out of Sonawood. That is literally just wood that they compress. And they have Swiss certification. So the government of Switzerland actually has a sustainability certification process for companies in Switzerland. And you know, Switzerland is really interesting in the Alps because of landslides and avalanches and things. They've actually been doing sustainable harvesting since the early 1800s. And interestingly enough, because we're working with a supplier over in Switzerland, they don't allow petroleum run vehicles, chainsaws, etc. in that area. So they all have a different type of fuel that they use to run their heavy equipment, their trucks, their chainsaws, even the helicopters that they use to take some of these trees out. So they are taking climate change really seriously. So it's been, what I really want to do is get some of the foresters from here over there to see what's going on. And also the foresters from the Coquille Reservation. So we've got compressed recycled paper, compressed wood, and then these are just synthetics. So polycarbonates, plastics, etc. are coming out on the market as well. In order to get luthiers to change, part of what we have to do is convince them that what they're using isn't what they think it is. So most of the luthiers think ebony is one thing, and they remember this really hard, dark, dense ebony from the 1950s and the early 1900s. We have long memories and long traditions. In fact, the wood that we're seeing now is very different than what we were getting even in the year 2000. So this is the change. This is average ebony. So what I was using as a luthier in the 1990s in the year 2000. This is AAA grade ebony bought in 2020. This is average ebony bought in the year 2000. We don't know what species this was. We can't trace the species, and customs cannot do genetic identification on the species when these parts come through the border. So part of what we tell people is that, look, if we don't change, what customs is going to do is they're going to just list at CITES 120 different species that could be ebony, because they can't identify it when it comes across the border as a fingerboard. And they're going to just say, okay, all of this is off the block. You can't have any of this. They're not going to sit there and try and determine what species you've got. They're just going to say, okay, it looks like ebony to me. So off it goes. The other thing is that the luthiers have been complaining because the grade of the ebony that we're getting has gotten so much worse. It just isn't holding the neck straight. It's not strong enough. It's really hard to work with because it chips out. It's got larger pores. It's uneven grain structure. So we don't even know what it is most of the time. So talking to them about what they've got, why these different species are different. They're not the same thing. And then talking about the alternatives that we have. So technically speaking, Gaiatone is a composite. Talking to them about why that's advantageous. It's more consistent. We can determine the hardness. We know it's going to be the same thing every time we cut it. Then developing tooling that actually works with this kind of material as opposed to wood. And that's been the other project that our shop has been working on, is developing different blades that work in the same block planes that we've been using for hundreds of years, well, for 100 years. but that will cut these harder materials the way we're used to. So that's been a huge project. That's been 2 years. Then what we've been doing is working on the next generation. I mean, some of the older guys, we've got wood to last us till we retire. So they're like, well, I'm not buying any other fingerboards because I've got the ones that I've got. I don't need to buy more. And I'm just going to use the ebony up. And then we try and talk to them about the fact that, well, that's okay for you, but the musician who buys that instrument and in 10 years has to go across the border with that instrument, and they have to have paper documentation, and ebony's on the endangered species list, they're going to have a problem. And the luthiers say, well, it's not my problem. So that's been a little hard to deal with, but working with these guys has been great. These guys are like surrounded by climate change. They're really concerned about endangered species, and they're all in on experimenting. So they've been our biggest source of feedback, means of changing, you know, the materials, developing the materials and the blades that we're looking at. So we've been, we did pilot projects in Chicago, Quebec, France, Parma in Italy, and the Cremona School, which is kind of the Harvard of violin making as well. And then Mittenwald, Mark Neukirchen in Germany are both interested as well. The Swiss Lutherie schools are interested as well. We'll just keep plugging away. The other thing we talk to makers about is that we have to invest in the forests that we're getting this wood from. We can't just expect other people to take care of it for us and then we go in and buy wood as cheap as we have been in the past. So traditionally, the wood prices have been low, and they've been going up rapidly the past 5 years, in part because of climate change projections. But what we've been telling them is that, look, you have to work with these tribal reservations and start investing by paying more for your wood so that they can harvest sustainably and take care of those forests. So basically, if we want to have a future as musicians and makers, we need to ask the questions. What wood am I using? Where did it come from? Was it harvested legally? And was it harvested sustainably? Yeah. That's it. Thank you. Yeah.
A question.
Yeah.
When imports come in, whether it's going from Canada or wherever,
Yeah.
stuff is seized by the governments?
So when wood products get to Customs and Border Protection, we are asked as the importer to fill out a document called the Lacey Act document. It's PQ 505. And on that document, we have to list by HS code. So anything that's imported into the US falls into a chapter of a large book that lists every possible thing that could be imported and gives it a code number. So we have to list by code number what we're importing, the genus and the species of the wood, all of the different woods, how much, like how many pounds, kilograms, whatever, or cubic meters. We have to give some measurement of how much wood is being imported, the value of it, and where that wood was harvested. Not where it was exported from, but where that tree was cut down. And then we have to sign it. And we are legally bound to the information on that document.
So if some part of that fails,
Mm-hmm.
and you have your wood right there at the border,
Mm-hmm.
what happens to the wood? Does the government confiscate it?
They can. Yep.
And then what happens to it?
Well, what happened to Teresio, they were exporting bows, and they didn't even consider themselves actually exporting it, although I don't know why. They are based in the US. They had a collection of bows and violins that they were doing auctions with in the US and in England. So they were exporting it from the US to London for this auction. And they were listing all the different things that were in those bows. It got to London, actually. And they said, oh, you've got ivory frogs on these bows. That's illegal. We don't allow that into our country. They confiscated it and they destroyed the bows. And these were bows worth like $80,000. This wasn't like your normal bow. These were historic bows. But it's serious, you know? And their point was, you need to know the law. Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
Well, what are all of these rules and regulations done to the cost of a violin?
The rules and regulations in and of themselves don't do anything to the cost of the violin. It doesn't cost me anything.
I don't believe that, and you don't either.
Well, let me finish. Okay, so it doesn't do anything to the cost of the violin. What does do something to the cost of the violin is when we change our behavior. So if we say, okay, I can only get sustainably certified wood now because I want to export my instruments potentially to Europe. I have to work 20 times harder to get that wood. And in fact, in the US, there were no sawmills that would cut that wood for me. So I had to go out to Oregon, and this has been a 1.5-year project, source the wood from the Coquille Reservation. I had a logger that I was using initially. I was trying to explain to him how we cut our wood for musical instruments, which is totally different than what you do for flooring, for furniture, for tables, all of, construction. And say, okay, I need it cut this way. He's like, yeah, I can do it. I get this first pallet of wood, and it's all cut wrong. So I am sitting there resawing all of this wood. I got a planer joiner, we've got our band saws. We're spending hours recutting all this wood. That's where the cost is. That costs money. Yeah, and then that does raise the price, yes. If we can get our supply chains under control, then it can be back in order. Does the documentation and the accreditation and all of those things cost money? Yes. That would be the other part. So when we are FSC certified, we will have to pay $2,800 a year to maintain that sustainability accreditation. That is a cost, and that will be added in. Yes, but relative to our overall sales, that's pretty small for us. If I was a single maker and I made 10 instruments a year, yeah, I think that would raise the cost of their instruments. But to be honest, the main problem with paperwork is when we're using large companies like UPS or FedEx who don't understand how those regulations work. And I've got to be on the phone to them and say, look, I know my exporter put a copy of the Lacey Act paperwork in that package coming across the border, but unless I sign it, it isn't legal. So you can't take their paperwork, you have to get it from me. That's a problem. Yeah. Go ahead.
And the underlying reason for this is because there are no suitable alternatives in terms of creating sound. The bow must be part of the creation of the sound that you're looking for.
Well, so we'll talk about Pernambuco for a minute there. Again, tradition. You have players out there who are making $100,000, $200,000 a year playing with the Metropolitan Orchestra or the Boston Symphony. And every stroke they make is how they make their money. So they are very concerned about sound, and they are very used to developing technique relative to Pernambuco, which has a specific feel, which has a different response rate, which closely aligns with the spruce tops that we have in terms of the speed at which sound travels through that material. Having said that, I think it's the fear of the unknown and the financial risk that these guys face that makes them reticent to change. Change usually does not come from that level of player. Change starts at a much lower level where people don't have the same financial risks associated with it, and they're willing to do the experimentation and the trial. That's why working with the Lutherie schools is so much easier than working with a maker who is selling his instruments for $50,000 a year and doesn't want to take the risk. So that's, a critical factor here. Are there alternatives to Pernambuco? Absolutely. Carbon fiber bows were actually first developed between Coda and Massimo Lucchi's father, Gaetano, in Italy. Gaetano was a famous bass bow maker. He had been making bows for years, was selling his bows for large amounts of money. His son was an engineer, and they teamed up with an American company to make the first fiberglass bows. And those bows worked really well. And Coda is a very successful company, and a lot of professional players have carbon fiber bows as their second bow.
How about fingerboards? Same situation?
Yeah, the biggest obstacle for fingerboards was that initially our alternatives were made, that compressed material made out of maple, beech, and spruce. So they looked different. They were a lighter color. Physically, the University of Switzerland had gotten a grant, and their engineering department put all in on compressing this wood so that it had identical strength characteristics to ebony. They spent their time figuring out how to compress this wood so that it had and reacted and had the same velocity as ebony. But the makers just didn't want to do it because they were like, well, it's a different color, so my customers won't like it. So we spent 2 years putting it on 100 of our instruments, sending it out there, taking photos, getting responses. And actually the teenagers were the best. They were like, oh, I like that color better. Because they're teenagers, what do they know? They don't care.
The style took over.
Yeah, it was. It was like, the colors of Benetton. It was the colors of your fingerboard, whatever. So that was kind of fun. Was it enough to convince these guys making $50,000 instruments? That's been a harder sell. The Gaetone is black, so that has worked really well. But it's harder. So then you have to deal with the tooling issues, because they don't want to change their habits. They want to be able to do the same thing the same way, have the same result, and we just need to figure out how to make that happen for them. That's not how change works. Right? You know it, I know it, they know it. They just are, again, that economic financial risk in a tradition that is very, very, very anal. Very. So it's a challenge. Yeah.
Now, all around the country, there are violins and fiddles in closets that people don't pay any attention to.
Yeah.
Because whoever played them is dead or whatever.
Yeah.
And is there any likelihood that some of these have these rare woods and we weren't aware of them?
Almost all of them have ebony. I mean, that's almost all of those old instruments that come into the shop have ebony fingerboards. Now, fingerboards don't last forever. I mean, the more you play it, the more it gets worn down. It is a hard wood, but it's not metal. It's not impermeable, and it's going to change. So you can replace fingerboards, and we do all the time replace fingerboards. And the fingerboards that we make, all the different types, it's easy to switch those in. Yeah. Other questions?
Any final questions?
I'm curious about,
Yeah.
We've talked about the degree of temperature change that's affecting us over here.
Yeah.
So certainly the tropics are going to also see that.
Yeah.
And so we may probably wipe out some of those species also down there.
Yeah, it's, when you go back to the glacial age, the temperatures were colder or more extreme at the poles, and then it moved down. So that's why our temperature on average was 11 degrees Fahrenheit colder, but if you were up in northern parts of Canada, it would have been much more colder on average. That's kind of what's happening with with climate change, is that those warmer temperatures are hitting the northern latitudes faster than they are, and it's slowly going down. Now, it's not even. So if you have a higher elevation, like in Vermont, you know, it's going to warm up slower than the central U.S. So if you look at those, the NOAA did a whole bunch of maps, graphing or projecting where and how that temperature change was going to occur. And you'll see the central U.S. starts warming up much more rapidly than the Green Mountains do. So that by the end of the century, you know, ours might be 20 degrees warmer, but, you know, central U.S. will be 30 or 40 degrees warmer, kind of thing. It's just not even. And we don't really have good models right now for predicting exactly what's going to happen where. We just have a general sense, and they're changing those models. Yeah.
Thank you, Kathy.